because military has always, always means really always from the Stone Age, is using the tool of communication, and it is to, first of all, to display your strength. You show everybody what you can do and hide your weaknesses. This business has not changed today significantly. It has changed only one certain little portion. The speed and the scale has changed significantly, but it is all about the same thing. How I would make sure that I am stronger than you. And that is, I think, the question needs to be answered. It's not about whether the military should do something on that. It's about that we should do. And I would divide, as military, I would divide their operation of strategic communication in three main lines of operations. The first one, and I think the most important one, is how we would make sure that we do believe in ourselves. As a nation, coming from the small nation, it is not always easy. So you have to make all possible to make sure that yourself believe in yourself. That means that you know that you are strong. You know that you will be able to fight any adversaries if needed, and you need to believe in your government, in your system. Only then it is possible to win, militarily or otherwise. I think that was something which in Ukraine was a challenge, because the Ukrainian people, especially on Crimea, they did not believe in their government. They didn't believe in the course. They didn't know actually what the Ukraine is. But after the conflict, today they are stronger than they have ever been as a state, because now they understand the benefits of an independent government and democratically elected system. And for that, what we in Estonia do, we do big exercises. We are, and we are very proud about that. We are a nation in arms, if you want. We have a conscript system. Every male and all the volunteer females can go through the conscript system. Everybody has something to do with it. Everybody has a direct contact to the military through their families, through somebody who is either in volunteer, defense league, National Guard type, or has been a reservist or is a reservist of the unity. And then through this we educate the whole society, and we tell them during the conscription and the years in the reserve that we are going to fight, and we are going to fight for the independence whatever happens. And I think that is the first mean of communication. And then, of course, these people are our communicators who make sure that our narrative is all over Estonia understood the same way. The second line of operation, in my opinion, is how we make sure that not only ourselves, we believe in ourselves, but that our friends and allies understand the things the same way as we do and believe in us as well. And that is where the soldier comes in, who goes to together with the Germans to Djibouti, with the French to Central African Republic, not exactly the place where Estonians like to be, or with the Brits and the Americans to Iraq and Afghanistan. They are the communicators, making sure that our friends and allies believe that we share the values and want to be part of the solution. And it is not always easy to make sure that everybody understands the reserve-based system. So the exercises like we had last May, or this May, with 18,000 people, that we can show our friends and allies, that is what we can do. We can fight for ourselves. And more importantly, and I don't think that is believed really in NATO, in all the countries of NATO today, that we will shoot back. That we will be fighting whatever decisions NAC will take in Brussels. So better take the decisions quicker, because there will be fight. In Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, there will be soldiers, 60,000 roughly, who will be fight for the independence for sure. And then alliances, possibilities to make it not happen by deterring everything. But if something happens, we need to have a plan in place. And that is not easy to convince. Okay, it's easy to convince the soldiers of the respective countries, but to convince the people and compete on this market with a Russian narrative, say in Bavarian villages or in some East German cities where people have lost their their faith in the government, to make them believe that it is worth die for little Estonia. It is not easy, and that narrative is important. That everybody understands Estonia is not a little Nazi country on the edge of Europe, but a modern, democratic, e-government-led, forward-looking country which is worth of fighting for. And then the third line of operation, which is the most difficult one for a small nation, and it is even difficult for alliance, is to fight with Russian propaganda, with Russian fake news, with governmentally orchestrated criminal behavior on the public domain, where they can tell every lie they want, and there's always somebody who would believe that lie. We have an example of that just recently. One of our conscripts, and if you have 3,500 conscripts a year, there's always somebody who is a bit strange. So one of our conscripts did shoot himself to get a cool scar, to come back from the service with a nice bullet wound. Don't do it, please. So that is one part of the stupid thing. But what it caused is how to handle it. And we've got, and I wrote down the questions and translated them. As you know, Minister Shoigu has launched, Defense Ministry and Russia has launched a channel called Sputnik, which only purpose is to deliver propaganda to Europe and to the respective countries in the Baltic states here as well. And the day it happened, and don't believe it is possible to hide. The second thing is, if you do the scar, don't put it in the Facebook. Again, not a very sinful thing. But anyway, we got questions almost next day. Do you confirm it was an ethnic Russian who was shot by the other conscript? That was the first question. So the question is already posed the way that whatever you answer, the answer will be wrong for you. And do you confirm he was mistreated in his unit to his nationality? These two questions. So it wasn't a Russian, first. It had nothing to do with others. He went alone to a separate place just to get the wound properly. He didn't get the medical advice before that, so he hit the wrong place, so almost died because of that. But what can you do with it? So it is very perfectly aimed, timed, so it is all the screen, always the public space is screened by Sputnik, so everything will be used against you. As everything I say here can be used against me. So what we did, we didn't answer anything. We took the so-called classic normal media, informed them about this kind of attack, planned attack, and denied answering the questions of Sputnik, and national broadcasting did the news about this fake news, how it will be, how they handled it. So, and we managed to avoid this particular thing. But that was absolutely sure you will not be able to do it always. So, in order to get all these three lines of operation proper, first thing, you need to know what is happening in the world, and it is much more difficult today as it was only newspapers, and that's not too long ago. I'm still reading paper newspapers, but not everybody does. So it is not difficult. It's very difficult to be aware of things, and then based on the information, analyze it, and get it then that the conclusions are right, and then act based on it, and that all in the cycle, in the loop, which is much, much quicker than even people like me were used to or are used to. So we need to learn how to handle this load of information, which means we need to have much more people on dealing with media and strategic communication that we ever had before. And the people is the problem, because everybody pays better than the government today. and all the modern development and all the technological advance is done not anymore by the military. 20 years ago. Even internet is an invention of military. We were not able to use it properly, but it was there. But today, Google and Microsoft are doing the things and paying the salaries. And how we get the professional people who know how to handle it to the governmental side, to the dark side, so to say, and work with us, it is very difficult. And I think the struggle in the future will be that. And the second thing, which I think will be my last point, if we work in alliance, and we are hampered by the need to say only truth. We are not allowed to lie. So this is a concern for. We are not able to get the messages over from the alliance because every nation tries to do its own messaging. But in certain things, I think Afghanistan campaign is one of the best examples. You need to get your messages right there, together as alliance. So that would be from my side what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, General. We had 3 operational lines, and we have the first strategic message, don't shoot yourself. Very easy to remember. With that, we will head on to General Whitecross, who is the commandant of the NATO Defense College in Rome. A beautiful place to be a commandant of, I assume. You have a very, as all generals, a very experienced background, but I think that the most significant part is that you are very good at blowing up things, since you are an engineer by profession. So it will be very interesting to hear you combine communication and blowing up things. It's more or less the same.
That could be dangerous. Thank you, Eric. So you just answered a question that has been in my mind for many years, and that's why was I picked to go to Afghanistan to be the Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategic Communications, and because you said strategic communications is rocket science, and I am an engineer, so now I've finally been able to close the loop on that to figure out why Canada sent me. And it had nothing to do with the fact that I am not a communicator. So when I was invited to this session, I read the questions that were going to be asked. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to use an example from my own experience in using strategic communications and sort of answer those 3 questions in a very pragmatic way, and then maybe a couple of thoughts toward the end. I could have used my experiences in Afghanistan, and I'm happy to do that during the question and answering, because I think I have a few things to say about that. But I want to use a little bit more of an emotive example, and that's when I was in Canada in my last job as the commander of the strategic response team on sexual misconduct. So please bear with me on the topic. It is an important topic for many of our nations, but I would like to sort of expand upon the way that we use strategic communications in the development of that topic. So just a little bit of background first, and this was something that came out of the media. So a huge media spread in the national magazines in Canada, both in French and en français, in English and in French. Our national magazines came out with these commentaries, these very large spreads on sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces. Very difficult, very emotional topic for all of us to experience. But when they were on the front page, it was very difficult as well for us not to do something in a very pragmatic sense. So I was assigned by the commander, or the CDS at the time, to put a team together and to address the issue. In doing that, even before that, we had a justice minister go out and talk to a number of people, and she wrote up a report, and our job was to actually address the report. So that's just a little bit of the background. So in the setup of, when the report came out, the setup was pretty easy. I find a strategist that could help me with strategies and to bring things forward. I found a planner that helped me put an action team together. But the third line that I got, which was almost more fundamental than the first two, was a strategic communicator that I brought in as a contractor, ex-military guy, and we used him profusely throughout the experience to really help us set the tone. And the very first thing that we had to do was create a narrative. Now, you would say that the narrative was already out there. The narrative was provided to us by these national magazines. But the fact is, we needed to create our own narrative on how we were going to address it. So we needed a short-term and a long-term narrative, and he was actually fundamental to that. And in developing the narrative, that helped us identify the strategies and the planning that we needed to go ahead and to do. Now, the planning had to be very comprehensive, which had to be part of the narrative, because we were going to tackle this on many, many venues, not just in terms of addressing potential offenders, but addressing the system, the systemic problems that actually were behind it. So we had to put those two together. So let me just go to the comm strategy now. In developing the comm strategy, so we had this narrative, a short-term and a long-term strategic narrative that we put forth. And it was fundamentally important, and I think it was essential to the success of this particular mission, that the whole chain of command had a buy-in to not just the narrative, but to the problem set, the fact that there was a problem, and then what we needed to do in order to address it. So those were, in my humble opinion, the pivotal aspects of the strategic communication plan. Ownership by the chain of command, from the chief of the defense staff all the way down to the unit commanders throughout the entire Canadian forces. And it had to start at the top, and it had to go all the way down. And in fact, what happened was also leadership from the bottom moving its way up. So in the short term, we had to get the message out. So there's a tremendous amount of communications, as those of you who are professional communicators know. We needed to get the message out on what we were doing and what the action plan also talked about. But we also needed to identify what best practices were, so we created the environment where we went around. I went to many countries that probably many of yours came to visit you to figure out what was the best way in order to tackle this insidious behavior. And we had to incorporate that into the, not just in the narrative, but into the action plan. And then I had to do something which was a little bit more difficult, and that was go to the town halls across the country and to speak to 30,000 Canadian Armed Forces members, about a third of the Canadian Forces population, and to discuss everything that had happened and to impress upon both the leadership of their responsibilities and to impress upon the members of the Canadian Armed Forces what is behavior that will and will not be taken. So in the short term, that's what we did in terms of the communication strategy. In the long term, we had to create a comprehensive approach. We had 4 lines of operation. The first was understand. understand what the situation is. I think we all understand what the problem is, but we had to understand how it affects people, understand best practices and the like. Second one was really respond to incidences in a very timely and resourceful way. The third was to support the victims of this misconduct. And then the fourth one, of course, is to ensure that it was prevented and that we weren't going to be having to deal with it again in another 10 years' time. And all of those required a very steadfast and very, I would say, pragmatic, tangible communication strategy that we had to use throughout the entire endeavor. So the chain of command aspect, and I would say that strategic communications is owned by the chain of command. The CDS at the time, in fact, the CDS that just started, who is the current CDS, actually literally brought the senior leadership of the Canadian Armed Forces to Ottawa. So all colonels, formation commanders and above, and their chief warrant officers, we literally sat in a room and we talked about it, and we ensured that the narrative was consistent with what everybody believed. Because they had to believe, A, that there was a problem, and I think the general mentioned this in terms of the nation's military capacity, but they had to believe that there was a problem, they had to believe that there was a solution set to that problem, and then they had to believe that they had a part to play in that problem. And all of that actually came around in terms of our ability to communicate that in many, many ways. And it wasn't just through the written documents. It was through personal engagements, one-on-ones. It was through group engagements. It was through action plan development, and of course through the more off-the-shelf type of media engagements that we were faced with. We still have a big problem, as most nations do, but I think we're getting there, and I think we took the right turns in many ways. We saw an increase in reporting, which is a little counterintuitive, probably to many of us, but when things start to get better, people report them a little bit more readily. I would like to just mention a couple of things in my last 2 minutes left, things to consider. The information management. In this particular phase, it became abundantly clear that information management was absolutely essential to ensure that the narrative was correct, that the people were saying the right thing, and that the information was steadfast between the CDS and down to the unit commanders. We need to embrace what's out there in terms of information management. So it wasn't just the word, it wasn't just through personal engagement, it was through social media outlets, it was through all of those other things that you spoke about today and yesterday, and it's using to the betterment of the organization. And we had to create trust in a value-based system and a value-based organization, because when you create trust, you increase, when you have increased trust, you have reduced risk. And I think that can be extended to any of the operations we have, militarily or otherwise. If you could increase the trust that the people that are leading the effort are doing the right thing, your nations are doing the right thing, you will have a reduced risk of people taking the wrong decisions and working unilaterally in another venue. And the last point I would like to talk about is the say-do gap. It is fundamentally important that that gap be reduced as much as possible. In this particular environment, it was difficult, and I have to say we did not succeed, because when some people continue to do the insidious behavior. And what it did was it created question marks and a lack of trust in the people when they could see what we're saying, and yet we were still being faced with the behavior that we were trying to get rid of. Even though the behavior was reduced, even one episode or one incident puts a lot of the actual effort and positive movement that we're doing and moves it to the back. So the say-do gap is fundamental to success in any strategic communication environment. I will leave it at that. My time's up anyway. I will leave it at that, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. You know that you are moderating a military panel when you are saying operational lines. Both of you had used that word. We perhaps going to come back later on what that means. I also noticed that you used the same word both, believe. So we will get back to that. Now I have Mr. Mark Later, by my side. For you who are within the StratCom community, Mark is a household name, I would say. I will not go through your career in extensive details, but I'm not sure if everyone knows that Mark has received the highest honor that can be bestowed on a communicator. You know, most people dream about order or medal or perhaps a statue, I don't know. You have had a conference room called after you. So if you are longing for some Mark Leite feeling when you're in Riga, you can actually go to a conference room here at the center called Mark Leite. That's extremely nice, I think. I hope to have that once myself.
Without
Mark.
being dead. Thank you very much. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I want to look very much at some of the practicalities, but also some of the bigger issues that we're facing. The topic is the world of Wordcraft and why we should care. And I think the first thing to look at is, what is war? Because I think this is one of the fundamental issues which affects how the military should act and how we should use the military. What is war? You know, we're very casual about it, you know. So President Trump is at war with Prime Minister Trudeau, right? I've read that, okay? But of course, we know it ain't. Manchester City fans are in a permanent state of war with Manchester United fans. But when people like me say war, I work for SHAPE, clearly I mean tanks rolling across the border. So war is a term to be used carefully because it can be misinterpreted. But what is war is something that is fundamental to why the military should care about it. And what we've got up there, for those of you who've unfamiliar with it, is the famous Gerasimov slide. There will be a deep sigh, some of the people who've seen it far too often. This has often been interpreted as indicating how the Russians intend to fight conflict. And it was first issued around 2013 by General Gerasimov in an open source publication, and he is the chief of the Russian General Staff. It's not how the Russians plan to fight war, it's how they think war is fought, which is far more profound. Now, logically, if that's how they think war is fought, then that's probably how they're going to fight it. So it is an indication of how they see war will be fought by them. But it's more important than that, is they think this is the nature of war. And actually, in general terms, I think they're right. So if you consider this is war, and you can see it, you'll see that the phasing of the operations starts covertly in phase 1, works through escalation, and then initial conflicting actions, which is the prelim to war, phase 3, then the crisis, which is fighting, then resolution, and then tea and medals. If you look at that, you'll see that there's only one element which goes from phase 1 to the conclusion. There's only one element that straddles the blue, which is non-military, and the grey, which is military, and that's information confrontation. So the Russian view of how conflict is fought is that information confrontation starts at the beginning, runs right through to the end, and straddles military and non-military. And it's the only thing that does. And you'll also note that the phase 1 is covert. So what is war? Because if that is true, we're at war. And I think a lot of people would say, in many respects, what's going on now, you can see those phases unwinding. So that is a terribly important thing to analyze, not as saying what it says about the Russians, but what it says about their analysis of how the world is. And we should ask ourselves, are they right or wrong? And I think actually the answer might be, they're pretty much right. In which case, what does that mean for the military? Now, Gerasimov last year gave one of his lectures in which he highlighted again that states in general, but also Russia in particular, postulate that achieving, quote, information dominance is an indispensable prerequisite of combat actions. So in other words, unless you are already winning the information, unless you've already set it up, you're going to lose because it's a prerequisite of combat actions. And that included mass media and social networks. So again, he's acknowledging and stating that for everybody, including Russia, information dominance is an indispensable prerequisite of combat actions. So again, this clearly means stuff for the military. And Gerasimov is not just making this stuff up, it goes into their thing, but it also goes back into the dominating principles of war. Now, I'm aware that there's this conference bingo thing, which I'm assuming some of you have been filling out, and that there's been a big gap. The thing on the top left, the Sun Tzu quote. And I'm sorry for you. You are my target audience. That's another one. Tick. And so in this theater, tick, I'm going to give you a Sun Tzu quote. Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win. Now, that's Gerasimov. He is saying information dominance is an indispensable prerequisite of combat. Sun Tzu says victorious warriors win first and then go to war. So they link. And this is a conscious link. These, the Russians do doctrine and they do their history. So what is war? Well, clearly we're part of it. The Russians also talk about they do not have a cyber domain like we do. Cyber in their doctrine is a subordinate element of an information domain. So for them, cyber is like a golf club, and the game is information. I would argue personally, but I am communications director, that cyber is not the lead element. Cyber is a tool, and information is the domain. So again, what does that mean for us? So fundamentally, what is war? I think it's pretty clear that war is a much bigger thing. And therefore, when we are at war, and when the military are involved, is also a much bigger thing. So why is StratCom so important for the military? Well, interestingly, and Christine mentioned about the say-do gap. So let's look at the doing. There's levels of war. Pole mill, strategic, operational, tactical. The tools of information, kinetic and non-kinetic, lethal, non-lethal, soft, hard, the lower down you go, the more tools there are. So if you are a spokesperson for NATO, what is your tool? Your tool is actually your own speeches, your Secretary General's speeches, that kind of stuff. And then you give D&G, goes down through the chain to the military. What are our tools? Our tools, and you highlighted them, they're B-52s, they're Gripens, they're F-16s, they're Typhoons. So actually, for StratCom is about far more. So there's too many people who still see StratCom as public affairs on steroids. And it's not. It's about communicating. And everything, as was stated, is communicating. The fact I'm wearing a tie, earlier today we saw one guy with a nice haircut, open neck shirt and a leather jacket. He was sending you a message. He was saying, I'm not like you. So everything we do is messaging. So if you're dropping a bomb, you're messaging. If you're digging a well, you're messaging. If you're walking, you're doing your patrol with helmets on, you're messaging. If you're taking them off, you're messaging. So think of the range of tools. Almost all of those tools in the security world are in the realm of the military. The same thing with communication. How do you communicate? Who do you communicate with? At the political level, it's relatively easy. The Cabinet Office, Oana Lungescu, the NATO spokesperson, she talks to her office, she instructs. It's quite a small bubble. But if you want an organization like the military to do your messaging, it's complicated. Because you've got the strategic level, you've got the operational level, you've got the tactical level. You've got people who drop bombs, you've got people who dig wells, you've got air, land, sea. How do you get coherent messaging to all of those people? That's StratCom. So the coordinating function of strategic communications is far, far harder at the military level and far more important. Because I, as the lead communicator for ACO, I have to make sure that the whole of ACO knows what we want. From the public affairs branch in the same building as me to the person who might be patrolling a street in Kosovo or ISAF. So again, we need to care because we need to get that message out because everyone is messaging. So StratCom is actually more important for the military because of the structural, organizational, and tools base than it is at the highest level, where PA on steroids will actually get you quite a long way. So we really need to get this right. So what are our challenges? We have a lot of challenges. One of the things is still up there. It's the phasing. Let's assume that the Russians are doing this, which I think is a fair assumption. Escalation is the point at which many of the military tools come into effect. We do not use PSYOPs early. It has to be approved by our nations, rightly so. But it means that a lot of the military capability is not used until in Gerasimov's stage, it's all over. So we need some top-level thinking about how we phase the use of military information tools. Because at the moment, we're basically waiting for the tanks to cross the border. But if we listen to Gerasimov and Sun Tzu, and actually our own military history, we know that those preemptive phases are actually critical. They set the tone. We need to do better on training and education. I have seen very few officers come through all the time from top to bottom. We do not have a professional military strategic communication in general. Some nations, Canada, a notable and noble exception with its PA people. The Germans do PA training. The Americans do a lot. Most nations, they train people for 1, 2, 3 weeks, or not at all. So we continually get in our nations, both for NATO offices and NATO nations, a bunch of usually very keen, very dedicated, total amateurs. Total amateurs. So they come in, they have a vertical learning curve, they get to be reasonably good, then they're on to their next post and they never touch StratCom ever again. This is lunatic. If we all accept that StratCom is as important now as we all seem to accept, why is it that we have organized ourselves for permanent amateurism? Which is exactly what we've done. So that's something we need to look at. We also need to ensure that we are big enough to create a career, that we're big enough when we have a structure. Things like EFP, nephews, phrases like that, they're actually StratCom teams. But some of the EFP units have got very small information elements, which again is crazy. Because frankly, if you've got a battalion of 600 people, you're not going to make a lunge from Moscow. And whether it's 600 people or whether it's 590, an extra 10 people in StratCom makes a hell of a lot of difference to your messaging. So we need to think, are we structured right for this? So these are real fundamental questions to take seriously what we say we take seriously. So the conclusion, we have to find a way of this smooth flow to ensure that our militaries are ready to support us to get success, to prevent peace becoming crisis, and if crisis becomes war, to ensure we win it. Are we ready for that? Questions, please.
Thank you, Mark. When I said that we were longing for public officials who are straightforward and no nonsense, I didn't imagine that you would say that our military guys were amateurs, but we have to take this from this point forward. With that, we have concluded the introductory remarks, and I would like to head to a small discussion with the panel to highlight some of the topics that you have mentioned. And I have a few questions for you, ladies and gentlemen, but I think that the first thing I would like to address is the common denominator between the two generals. You both said that you need to believe. Both your operational lines included believe for the main task, either to persuade or to have a response. You need to believe what you're doing. If we turn this pyramid, here we have an executive decision level or the highest ranking officers in NATO, but if we turn it upside down and talk about soldiers, sailors and airmen, how do you get them to believe what you are actually doing? Is it about leadership? Is it about communication? Or is there already the belief in what they're doing? General Whitecross.
I was actually going to defer to the senior general on the panel, but happy to go first. I sincerely believe it is an issue of leadership. It's an issue of training and education. When we bring our soldiers, sailors, and airmen and airwomen into our militaries, it's to, I'm going to use the word inculcate them, but I mean that in a very positive way, and to the value systems that the military believes in, and to to train them and educate them on what we do and why we do it, and the capacities that we were building, and to create the environment where they can actually communicate that to their colleagues, their battle buddies, as it were. So I believe fundamentally it is an issue of leadership. I also believe fundamentally it's an issue of education and ensuring that what we do and what we say mean the exact same thing.
I think not to say that you have to underestimate the soldiers and the sailors and airmen by having a very simple messages. But I think simple messages will work better throughout. And we have a couple of experiences in Estonia where we have used certain narratives which have worked pretty well. The one is Estonian soldier is the best soldier in the world. And everybody can say it for themselves, but we have used that, and it didn't work until Prince Harry came to visit us with more than 40 journalists around him and said it in one sentence, and then it was all over the world, quoted 600 times during 1 hour, and then it worked. But the message was already there before, and we believed in ourselves because we said, hard-fighting infantry soldier without caveats, that's an Estonian soldier. And today, every American general who comes to visit me starts with a narrative which I'm happy to receive. Not putting the other soldiers are less good, but that is important. The second thing we experienced it, how to make sure that all the reserves, all the people, and the reserve people are not the easiest people to do. They are all over the place. Some of them are forced to conscription. That's not voluntarily coming, but they have to come. How we make sure that they go out and are multiplying our positive message and not saying it all was rubbish and I wasted my time and never come again. You have to be very professional of dealing with these people and taking them as equal in every step of their career, from the conscription to 60 years as they leave the reserve. And then you need one narrative there as well. And couple of 2015 we had our big reserve exercise. That time 13,000. This year we had it 18,000. And we had a very easy line to remember. The exercise is called Hedgehog. And Hedgehog in Estonia is not the little furry animal. It is a porcupine type animal. And we had the slogan, every quill counts. Easy to remember. Everybody understands that. and it works. Now the soldiers themselves feeling themselves as the quills of a hedgehog who is ready to defend themselves against even a brown bear. So I think to have the easy messages and believe in these messages, but to believe in it, you need to really put some deeds where your mouth is. And really, from very bottom to the top, everyone has to believe the message.
I will have Mark into that from a shape perspective. First, I would like to ask you about, because now you're talking about a belief from, let's say, individual soldiers within an individual nation. Do you think there is a possibility to have a common belief in a multinational operation from your experience? You've both been to Afghanistan, I think.
Yeah, well, the hedgehog is actually not new. NATO in 50s had the same narrative. NATO as a hedgehog against the world defending its alliance. The unity of messaging is very important. What is challenging the big organizations, especially NATO is now bigger than it ever has been, is to make the politicians of separate countries have a common NATO's messages delivered. Because everybody wants to talk to his own electorate, and I saw it in Afghanistan a lot, where the British Prime Minister went to Helmand and had his own messages, and the others are going to other places, Italians to Herat and so on, and having their own messages from their country government to their people. But actually what is needed is that they would go there and have the NATO's messages spread all over the world, and they should be the same. And that is not always the case. I think that is the most difficult one.
General Wordcraft, you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, could I just add that, just 2 points. One is, I think it's a lot easier when you have political will, political decision-making that supports your narrative. That really helps ensuring that everybody has the same understanding of why we're there, and in fact, the same trust in the system. And I would just add, and I completely agree with the General in terms of the multitude of messaging in the Afghanistan scenario, but when we do go away as a multinational organization, I think fundamentally we have to understand why we're going. And I do remember on many occasions having to go back to the fundamentals of why we were there, what happened in September of 2001, and sort of why we were there, and not just explaining it in a very comprehensive approach to the NATO allies and our partner nations as well, but also to the Afghans on the ground. So I think there's 2 parts there, the political will, the political understanding, but the fundamental reasons why we as a nation or why we as an alliance have to do something.
Mr. Later, please.
Yeah. I think the point is that you can have common narratives, but that doesn't mean they have to be expressed in exactly the same way. So, you know, if you take we've used a common line for a NATO narrative, which is working together to guard with courage and competence our homes and values. Now that is actually a good line that sums up NATO. Working together to guard with courage and competence our homes and values. But how you would express that needs to be tailored. So in Estonia, the hedgehog similarly works. It wouldn't work so well in some other countries. So they need to come up with their own. I was talking with a colleague earlier, and I said if I was wanting to use an inspirational quote, if I was a Turk, I would use an Ataturk quote, not a Churchill quote. And if I'm a Brit, I'd do it the other way around. So the commonality of narrative can be found, but it then needs to be individually applied to take account of the fact that we are an alliance of nations.
And how do you express that in your guidance?
Well, depending on the levels we do it. I mean, one of the things is you outsource it. So for instance, if you take the We Are NATO campaign, the We Are NATO is the common theme, which everybody has and everybody uses, and there's the same kind of fonts and colors and things like that. But then each nation follows through on it and tailors it. So it would be in what in military terms you call mission command. The intent is clear, the aim is clear, but how you put it into place is tailored to your circumstance. So I think actually the worst thing to do is to try and make it too tight. given them the broad guidance, and then let them get involved. And one of the other things that follows from that is that the more that individuals are involved, the more invested they become in making it work. You know, if you just say, here it is, and dump it on their desk, they just, But if you say, what do you reckon to this? What do you think? How could you make this better? The next thing you know is they're your biggest advocates.
Thank you. I will move on from belief to the decision-making process, which you're aware of in large organizations. It is complicated, and sometimes perhaps military is extremely complicated in terms that there are so many levels. And the things that we have been discussing for the last two days is we need to do decision-making fast in order to react what is said and done. Is the decision-making process that we have now within the military system suited for this new environment, or do we need to think in new ways? We will like to start.
Well, I don't think it is different. I think you can change a lot there. It's easy to know what is happening, analyze it, make a decision, and act. But how to do it quicker, I have not yet figured out that. In that speed, what the information is now changing or coming out, some mostly wrong information or rubbish, or whether you should do decisions based on that information, or as a military you still need to be sure that the information you get is right, and then take a decision. And very often the biggest challenge for us today is to make sure that the information is right, you base your analysis on. And I think that means focus, and that means, as I said, people, more people dealing with it. And that was already said. I agree with you 100% that you need. But the problem I mentioned is the people are not there.
Yes.
And you cannot get them because they are all better paid everywhere else.
Yes.
So the solution in Estonia is to get the people in the reserve units, put the uniform on only on the weekends, and they'll do the same or better job to you because they know everything all around, and they help us. And we have really a couple of good examples in Estonia where we use the civilian capabilities which are put in uniform in order to get the information right. First, the incoming information you base your analysis on need to be right, otherwise it will not work. And that, for example, we have a page, everybody welcome to visit, Propastop, which deals with the Russian propaganda, displays the propaganda and talks about it. And that is completely run by reserves, by civilians who work in the public information or strategic communication domain in the banks and companies.
It depends too, what kind of decision making you're talking about. I mean, I've worked with the military for nearly 20 years now as a civilian. The biggest delay that there has been in decision making at the grand strategic level has been, and I don't say this as a criticism, but it's been the NAC deciding what it wants to do. You know, and these things aren't easy, so I don't say it as a criticism.
That's not military, that's politics.
Exactly, but the point is that what you get is they will ask the military for options, the military will give them options, and there will then be a debate about which they accept them. Now that can be very often very time-consuming. If you take the Libya operation, there was never a NATO initiating directive, which is a fundamental thing that the military meant to have, because of that problem. Again, I don't say that as a criticism, but it's too easy very often to say that the military are slow, because often if the decision is slow, then the military are slow. That's logical. Now take it down a step to decision-making, if you like, in an active information environment. You come back, I would say, to mission command. We, in NATO, we have a policy, and it's being picked up, it's a practice picked up by several other nations, of doing a strategic communication framework. And that framework gives the basic aim, objectives, themes, coordination, and key topics. And that is a common thing for the whole of people involved. And they are then required to, okay, how do I make that theme sing and dance in practice? How do I operationalize that topic? Now that works. And this will only work if you empower. It's got to be trickled down, what the military call mission command, I would call empowerment, where you have very clear direction from the top in broad terms. This is what we're trying to achieve. Now over to you and how you achieve it. But of course that then also comes back, to be truly effective, you need better training. So, but it can work that way, and it is the only way it works when the flash to bang is a very long chain, inevitably.
General Whitecross, you're meeting generals and flag officers throughout from NATO at your academy, the Defense College. Is there an understanding, you think, about the new world, and is there thoughts of adding this for training or education within the NATO school?
Well, at the NATO Defense College, we talk about new technologies, and we talked about the decision-making cycle, and we talk about how people are bombarded with more information now than ever before in history. I think the balance is, there's a couple here. First of all, intelligence services are fundamental to the whole scheme, and if you have to have a very rigorous and very comprehensive intelligence scope, whether it's in the alliance or in your own nations. But there's a balance between information overload and the ability to make a decision in a timely way. And our commanders need to be taught or need to have an ability to make the right decision at the right time without analyzing every single piece of information that they have. I'm always reminded by Omar Bradley's Second World War, so the 1940s, who has said, a decision made with 80% of the solution, 80% of the information on time, but is better executed and more successful than one with 100% of the information being analyzed where you actually do the effect in a later date. So it's important that we balance the two and have the ability to make a decision, not based on everything, because you're never going to get there, but based on good intelligence as a scope.
Thank you. I would now like to open up for questions from the audience. I think that we have a microphone. I'll try to, we have a microphone. Start with the gentleman in the first row, and then this row, and then on the second row, please. And please remember to have your questions short for the panel, please.
Jonathan Isle from Russi. I wonder if I could turn it around a bit and what do we do, and a question more practical question of what do we do when actually the reputation of the military within a certain society works very well, but that in itself can be a hindrance. I refer, for instance, to the Afghanistan phenomenon, which our Canadian colleague will remember very well, of the fallen returning home, your Highway 401, our Wooden Basset in the UK. This phenomena of large crowds turning up to welcome back the fallen as they're being repatriated. And this general feeling that the military, which is loved and has a high respect in the national psyche, is a victim of politicians who don't know what they're doing, and they're sending them to die in a variety of God-forsaken corners. How do you deal with that message, which is a different message? It's not a message of your footprint with your population, but it is a message of a military that instead of being the instrument of power, appears, or at least in some parts, to become the victim of power.
Thank you. Mark, would you start?
Yeah, I mean, because we had this one big time. I think it's particularly prevalent in Britain because it's the lions led by donkeys syndromes, which is a famous fake news quote of a historian who's claimed that a German general looked at British soldiers in the First World War and said they were lions, but they were led by donkeys. And he made up the quote. So fake news is not new. I would say the answer to that is, first of all, I know that the military hate that narrative. They absolutely loathe being seen as victims. There may be individuals who don't, and I think the way to answer that is the soldiers themselves. It's no good a general going out, because this comes back to the credibility and authenticity issues. Authenticity these days is seen as being the same age, the same peer group, whatever, of the individuals. So if you want to talk to a 20-year-old, find a 20-year-old. So the victim syndrome, which I completely agree with you, was there. First of all, it recognized a weakness in the narrative in Britain at that time about why we were there. So there was a weakness to be played upon. There were families who were particularly angry and bitter, and their anger and bitterness has to be respected because they had lost loved ones. But that weakness in the narrative opened the way. The answer had to come from people who were out there, who were of the same age and the same peer group. It's no good a general in Whitehall saying that. However brave that general is, has been, they may have ribbons showing it. You actually needed to get out to Afghanistan and have the soldiers saying, we know why we're here, and we're here for a good cause. And that is really the only answer. And ultimately it faded away, but I think the British were a bit late starting up on that narrative because they tried to have the wrong people arguing the right thing. In the end, the right people argued the right thing.
General Terras, as the Chief of Defense, reputation is always of a concern. Do you have any comment?
I'm happy to say that we have not had that problem, and that's because the politicians never said we're going to make Afghanistan the most democratic place in the world. They said we go there because our allies all together have decided to go there, and we hope if we do what the allies decided to do with them together, so they will one day come back and help us if necessary, and the EFP is a good example of that exactly happening, or quick air policing, plane increased numbers in Ukraine. I think there's another danger as well, as we experienced during the Crimea and Eastern Ukraine war started. I was asked almost every day to give conferences, went to the papers everywhere, and all of a sudden we experienced that we are just appearing in the television started to make people feel that they are at war, even though the war was somewhere completely different place. So we decided I go out of the television and I'll not give any interviews, just because there was no war, but people started to feel themselves like in war. And I think you should be very aware of what these kind of messages give to. But as I said, the gap between, which was mentioned here in Estonia, we have not had it because the course is understood by everybody. We joined NATO because we were sure that NATO is an alliance which will defend us if we are too small to do it only on ourselves. With allies together, it is more possible. Of course, NATO was on contrary, thinking that we take them in because there's no war coming, so it's easy, no need to defend. Today the situation is different. We're happy to be in. That's why the Georgians are not in. I still think they should be taken in. So that was from my side.
General, I'll have the next question, but first, General Whitecross, you outlined your 4 operational lines on how to deal with sexual misconduct, which really, did the armed forces understand that this was something that would damage the armed forces, Canadian armed forces, if you wouldn't deal with it? Was it accepted?
Absolutely, because it went to the heart of the credibility of the Canadian Armed Forces
The
members.
reputation itself.
And it went to the heart of recruiting a diverse, a diverse military that is reflective of Canadian society. So that's the issue. Can I just address this one little issue? Sorry. I never got that sense, and because it was a grassroots-led emotional response to bringing soldiers home for the first time since the Korean War in body bags. And that might sound crude, and I don't mean it that way. But it was a swell and I got goosebumps thinking about it, because it was a very prideful way to acknowledge the soldiers, sailors, airmen and airwomen that fought in Afghanistan and came back home ill and injured or who had died. And I didn't get the link between, perhaps when I go back to my office and somebody will tell me otherwise, but I never got the link between the political requirement to go there, because, I mean, we in Canada, we live right beside the United States. And in many ways, we were conflicted just as much as our American colleagues on that fateful day. And I think that there was a tremendous sense of ownership of the problem, ownership of the solution set. So I didn't get that sense. I'm not sure what it was like in the UK, so I can't speak to that.
Definitely like it in the UK.
But I, I'm going to look at my colleague over here. Is he nodding his head? So he says I'm right, so this is good. Because I'd hate
Canadian general
I
nodding
would
in the
hate for it
first
to
row.
have gone a different way. But so anyways, I just offer that.
Thank you. A question from the gentleman in the first row.
Thank you. Patrick Tucker with Defense One. I appreciate how specific the discussion has been about Russian disinformation tactics and efforts and perceptions. I wonder if you could speak specifically about proposed changes within NATO, perhaps to come up in the next meeting in terms of resource allocation, in terms of policy, in terms of whatever else to better meet this threat. And following up on that, for Mark Laity, you mentioned a moment ago the perception, the Gerasimov-esque perception of information wars being a constant, permanent fact. And you suggested it's time that we consider adopting a similar perception, but presumably you don't mean we should hack Vladimir Putin's emails and give them to the BBC. Not that that would even work. What are you specifically suggesting as a response to that perception?
Well, first of all, let me immediately correct any potential misperception that I'm saying that we should follow Russian amoral methodology. It's about seriousness. It's about taking the issue seriously. But as I said, NATO has a narrative, which is that we are defending our homes and values. And I can't emphasize that enough. Homes and values. I worked for the BBC for 20 years. And the freedom of speech, the fight for objectivity are actually fundamental. I think an existential threat that we're having is loss of faith in objective discourse. That's actually one of the things that worries me as an individual and as a professional communicator more than anything else. So I am 100% against us using disinformation tactics of that kind for two reasons. First of all, it won't work because it will destroy our credibility, and credibility is a key weapon. And secondly, it's just plain wrong. You just don't do it. So with that, now in terms of, but we had for 40 years a Cold War. Now people keep saying we're not returning to the Cold War. Fair enough, but the point about the Cold War was an acceptance of an adversarial relationship which we needed to respond to. And that included things like the US Information Agency and so on like that. So don't worry about the terminology, but look at what we did when we had an adversarial relationship. What we did were things which were entirely consistent with our values, but what they were doing is they were countering Russian propaganda, they were ensuring that our nations were defended, and so on. So we need, the Russians are saying that there's an information confrontation ongoing. And if they are acting on that, and every piece of evidence that we can see is they are, we can't pretend it's not happening. So we are forced into a response. We must accept that this is happening to us, so we need to respond. We do not need to use the same methods. We shouldn't use the same methods because then we become like that we're defending ourselves against. But we've got to take it seriously. Now what NATO is doing is a whole variety of things. My own communication division is much bigger now, and that is reflected lower down the chain. We have a new policy on military communications, MCO 628, which is a radical revision of how we do our business, restructuring. Up at NATO HQ, they've got more money, they've got different structures, they're taking public diplomacy more seriously, StratCom more seriously, they're having campaigns. So there's a whole series of things we're doing, and then there's the reality on the ground. As I said, the nephews, the NFIUs, the EFP, the expanded NRF, these are not just military maneuvers, these are communication mechanisms saying the world may be a little more awkward than it was, but NATO can still fulfill its basic parameters. So when you think about how we're responding to the communication challenge, it's not just the fact that I've got more people in my office. It's a wider thing than that. Does that answer the question?
It's true that Riho Terras, you were in.
I just wanted to add a bit of what is the audience we're working with. I think if you look at the Russians versus the NATO or European countries, first audience for the Russian public lies is the Russians themselves, the people in Russia. I don't think this battle is lost. We are not winning that back. They, in all over 11,000 kilometers, they do believe what they are told, and we cannot turn it over. But is it dangerous? It is, but not that much. Much more dangerous is the propaganda aimed at the public of European countries. And that's not about the soldiers, which do not believe, but the stories which go to the Germans, French, or American citizens who vote for the next government and the values. I think this is where we need to do more and where we need to battle more, and that is actually the thing of the governments to do. And not, and as I agree, the message should be different to Turkey or to Germany, but it should be the same message, same theme. And I think EFP is a good example of how we are, if we want to, if we focus, we have got that narrative right, I think, from the very starting point. And so that is the operation we should keep on doing.
Thank you. Now we have a few additional questions. I would like you to be very short and, if possible, the answers as well. Gentleman on the second row, and then we have a gentleman in the white shirt.
Thank you. James Chandler from the British Army's 77th Brigade. A practical question. Please, your advice. What practical measures can I take to try and encourage a change of culture in the military to understand the importance of strategic communication? How can we change the culture so that the StratCom message comes first and the utilization of the physical domain and physical capabilities, fires and maneuver, comes in support of that? I'd appreciate your advice. Thank you.
Practical advice, who would like to start?
Who wants the poison pill first?
Go ahead.
Well, I can bring a parallel. It is the cyber world, of course, for Estonians important. How do you make sure that people, the problem normally lies between the chair and the screen, and how do you make sure that the people understand the threat and danger? It's very difficult. Then it came only, and we introduced things called cyber hygiene. That means every year everybody has to take a test on how to deal, and we decreased the number of incidents to almost 80% because of the training and the education. I think that is that every, and it is in some schools it is important, but I think in military academies, there is the place where young people come in already knowing the social media and so on, and to start with the young cadets to make sure that they understand the role of the social media in their military operations. It's easier to tell them because they already know. It's us to teach them will be difficult, but I think school training, education should take it as a from very starting point as one of the topics, along with the motor, machine gun, and the cyber.
Okay, we move on to the next question. Gentleman in the white shirt, please.
I think if I could just briefly, James, I think a lot of the seeds have been already laid. The very existence of 77 Brigade shows that things are changing. Primarily it's a leadership challenge, and if people who do communication jobs get promoted, then it's amazing how quickly things will change. I mean, and that's two very simple things. Leadership and actually it being seen as a necessary tick in your box. If you want to progress in the Army, Navy, Air Force, you need to do a communication job. Suddenly everybody will want to do them, and it will change very fast.
Gentleman in the white shirt, please.
Thanks. Bob Hobbs, I'm from the UK MOD, and as an Army officer, I'm a totally amateur strategic communicator. The question is, it's a little bit pointed, but how does the panel think that we maintain credibility. So Mark is right in what he says, and that everything we do as a military professional is an act of strategic communication, the right patrol, living our code and living our life by the values, and then doing the lethal aspects that need to be done on behalf of the nation state. How do we maintain that hard power credibility and have a career path in strategic communication, which is the soft end, and we don't go from having amateur StratCom and just having professional, non-lethal soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, obviously.
Can I just say something? Because I'm not quite sure I agree with what you said in that it leads the kinetic effect. I think it facilitates. I'm not sure one is the lead or the other. And I'm just a simple engineer, so maybe I got it completely wrong. But I see strategic communications to be just like any other part of the campaign plan. And it needs to facilitate the other lines of operation, which are kinetic and non-kinetic. And it has to be a conscious decision on what part it plays and how it will influence the information battle space of tomorrow, or how it will influence the kinetic and non-kinetic effect that the commander wants on the ground. I don't think it's a binary one and zeros. I think it's just a part of a whole. And I may not be completely supported on that by this side of the panel, but that's certainly the way that I see it. As a commander on the ground, it is a leadership issue, it is a chain of command issue, and it must be understood from all through, from the top down to the bottom.
Just to add to that,
Mark, keep your thoughts. I would like to the final questions we had as well. Please, lady in blue.
Good afternoon. Elizabeth Seymour, Information Ops, JFC Brunson. General Whitecross, the example you gave, you said you believed you failed in the say-do gap. Why do you believe you failed, and what measures have you been able to take that have proved more successful since?
Chief of the Defense Staff came on and said, this behavior will stop now. Canadian Armed Forces members, it won't happen again. And unfortunately, the reality is it did. So we said that we were going to eradicate it. It is very difficult, as you can imagine, in any social space to deal with that particular situation. But in terms of saying that we were going to do it and actually having new cases come up, in my humble opinion, we have not succeeded in that area. We have gotten better. We have gotten more reporting, which is intuitively, not necessarily intuitive to making sure that the scenario was better, but all of those have led to a positive progression. But the fact of the matter remains that new incidences have erupted. And because of that, in my humble opinion, that the say-do gap wasn't necessarily maintained.
Mark.
Well, I mean, that's a specific question to Christine,
yes.
but just to, we're not disagreeing, because the NATO definition of military StratCom is the integration of communication with other military activities. So it isn't one having primacy over the other, it's the fact that they are so integrated. And I think, but James is correct in saying that it's probably still a bit of a junior partner, but it isn't that it becomes a senior partner, it's totally integrated. And that's where we need to go. And part of it is trying not to let people think that we're doing a takeover operation, but in fact we're going to enhance them just like they're going to enhance us. So,
I think the point is that StratCom has become a much more powerful capability than it was in the past, so you need to recognize that and put more emphasis on that in order to shoot first and be successful with and to get to the target. That is the most difficult one, to get it to the point where it needs to go.
Thank you. We have had a panel of distinguished guests, and I think that at least we somewhat have answered the question why the military needs strategic communications. You have agreed on most of the things that have been said. It would have been very interesting to have a panelist who had said it doesn't matter, to have it a bit more complex discussion. But I hope that for you who are not familiar with the military world, at least you have getting some insights in the military thinking, and you at least have heard some very specific military words like operational lines. So I would like to thank the panel for interesting remarks, and I would like to thank the audience for your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.